Okay, well, it is 2 o'clock and there are a considerable number of you there. So thank you very much for visiting us again for the first time for some of you and returnees for many of you. As you are aware, most of you, Martin gave us a talk last week on his experience of being a Morris man in Mosley, and that's a bit of a tongue twister. And so I'm delighted to welcome Lucy today to give us a different perspective on a slightly different tradition. As before, we are recording the sessions and, excuse me, and if you'd like to ask a question but don't want to speak, because that will mean that you're recorded, then if you pop it into chat, if you press that button on the bottom of your screen, chat, you can put a question in there. And if I'm eagle-eyed enough, I'll go to it and ask it on your behalf if you wish. So Lucy's going to speak for approximately half an hour or so, and then she's very happy to take questions, comments, and have a bit of a chat. So thank you very much, and we welcome Lucy.
Thanks very much, Jane. And thanks for inviting me to come and talk to you this afternoon. It's really, really good to be here. I've been having all manner of problems with the internet over the past 2 days, so I've been really concerned that it was going to be crashing and not letting me get in to talk to you. So if it does go down, I have sent Jane a video so that you have got something to watch. But it seems to be holding up for now. I'm hoping it's gonna last for the rest of the afternoon. So yeah, my name's Lucy Wright. I'm an artist and a researcher, and I tend to wear quite a few hats, including currently as a research fellow at the University of Leeds, and I'm also a social producer for the arts charity Axis, who are based in Wakefield. A lot of the work that I do involves creating things with other people, especially those who might not ordinarily call themselves artists. And I'm at my happiest when I'm helping to find new ways to facilitate the sharing of stories, especially the ones that you don't hear very often or don't get listened to often enough. And I call myself an artistic researcher because I see my art and my research as two sides of the same coin. So my art as a practice of researching and my research as a process of art making. So I write things, I take photographs, I sew things, I illustrate things, and I help to choreograph performances and encounters. And you'll see quite a few examples of this sort of throughout my talk. All the photographs, I think, are in some way relating to that. And I do this not only because I feel that there are some things that writing, and perhaps particularly academic writing of certain kinds, they just don't express very well. But also because I'd like my research into living community practices to be a collaborative rather than an extractive process, a kind of researching with rather than researching about or to. So although I'm the one here giving the talk today about girls' carnival Morris dancing, I do so in debt to the many women and girls and the men who support them, who've been and continue to be my co-researchers and creators. So for almost a decade now, I've been really preoccupied with understanding and documenting contemporary folk arts. And by that, I don't so much mean the performances that you might see at a folk festival or even as part of sort of local calendar customs. A lot of these are legacies of the English folk revival, which maybe Martin talked a little bit about last week. And if they're not, they have perhaps been subsumed into it since then. And we know now that the Victorian collectors, from whom the great majority of our kind of canon of English folk performance were rather selective in their collecting habits. And although this in no way devalues the amazing folk arts that we have today that have survived to this present day, it does mean that certain aspects of the tradition have been kind of overlooked. And in particular, I would say that women's traditions, children's traditions, songs, dances and crafts are very much less likely to have been passed on than those practiced by men. And at the same time, the practices associated with northern industrial communities were much less well represented in the scholarship than the traditions of the south of England and rural places in particular. So what we understand as folk or traditional heritage is quite incomplete. You could also say it was biased and maybe even a little bit exclusionary. So what I'm interested in are the kind of hidden histories of performances that fall between the cracks of social and cultural history writing. I'm also really interested in thinking about what constitutes the folk practices of the 21st century. And these are often traditions that wouldn't, or practices that wouldn't necessarily use that term folk. They don't necessarily identify as folk arts. Folk is a really complicated and sort of twisty term that's gathered a bunch of quite uncomfortable associations over the years. So I'm thinking of things like, you know, nationalism, colonialism, you know, and even in its most benign form, sort of something quite nostalgic. But it's also at heart what happens when people come together, regardless of anything else, to engage in cultural activities that they create for themselves. So it's something that we all do. It's something that belongs to us all. It's the things we make and do and think for ourselves. And it seems really, really important in these times, if not, you know, more than ever right now. I think the idea of folk is much more powerful than it's sometimes permitted to be. So, see if I can change my slide. That's how I do it. So if you think you know Morris dancing, I know you had a talk last week with somebody from Mossley Morris Men, so that's amazing, and I'm really hopeful everyone's feeling well up to speed with that aspect of the Morris tradition. And before I move on, I just want to say this is a photograph of members of Lynn Morris Men from Cheshire, and they're wearing hats that I made as part of an oral history project I did a good few years ago now, in 2012 I think it was. And I should say that although these big, tall, flowery hats are traditional for this particular kind of style of Morris, the ones in the picture are not the ones that they wear when they're dancing. These are way too impractical for any of that. So yeah, if you think you know Morris dancing, think again. I'm here to talk about another branch of the Morris dancing family, and it's one that is frequently misunderstood and often missed out of the history books altogether. I'm referring to girls' carnival Morris dancing, which is sometimes a little bit disrespectfully called fluffy Morris, and this is a highly competitive team formation dance that's performed by girls and women. I've been researching girls Morris for little more than 8 years now, working primarily with a troupe from Skelmersdale in West Lancashire, and they're called Orcadia Morris dancers. They're the ones that you can see on the screen just now. And carnival Morris dancing is a style of dance that is unique to the northwest of England. Every time I do a talk and I say this, somebody tends to put their hand up and say, no, that's not true. We have it in Devon or Somerset or something like that. And, you know, while there are other dances elsewhere in the country that look a little bit like it, the performance territory for girls' carnival Morris dancing is, and always has been, exclusively limited to Lancashire, Cheshire, and a bit of a sliver of North Wales. And although the majority of the primary research that I'll be talking about this afternoon takes place in maybe Cheshire and Wigan sort of area, it is found throughout the Thameside and Mossley area. So on the screen right now, you can see two of your local girls' carnival Morris dancing troupes. There's the Thameside Diamonds and the Denton Zodiacs. There's a whole bunch of others. These are just the first two that I happen to find. It's really popular. Before I move on, just because it's so unusual, you'll spot maybe on the right-hand picture, the Denton Zodiacs, there are actually not just one, but two young men who are dancing as part of the troupe, presumably. And that's incredibly unusual. I reckon in the 10 years that I've been, 8 years I've been looking into this, I think I've maybe seen one other troupe that had a male dancer. So it's really, really great that there are boys in this particular group. Historically, as I'll mention later on, it did used to be a mixed performance. So it did used to be boys and girls dancing together, but it did end up becoming a much more, female dominated dance. So yeah, really, really interesting there. Girls Morris dancing has a long history, and it's really important to say straight away that that history is at least as long as any other form of Morris dancing that we have in the Northwest area. So, its history is very much tied to that of the other kinds of Morris dancing that you might be more familiar with. And although, unlike many folk revival Morris sides, which tend to be associated with a rather older demographic these days at least, girls Morris dancing is really, really popular with girls and young women. So we're talking all ages really, from about maybe 18 months old up to, up to as long as people feel able to carry on dancing. I would say that maybe the oldest dancer that I know of would be in their 50s. It is an incredibly energetic, exhausting dance. I am not fit enough to do it myself. So it does tend to be a slightly younger person's activity. And yeah, some very, very little. You can see in the Thameside Diamonds, very, very young kids get involved. And as I say, very popular. At the last time that I did a kind of estimated calculation of how many people are involved, I came up with about 8,000, which is about double that of all Morris dancing styles in the country put together. So it is, it's a really kind of comparably large community of dancers. However, in spite of sharing a common history, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, and that reaches back to the 19th century, today, girls' Morris dancing community is an entirely different one than the one that's grown up around the folk revival and the other forms of Morris dancing that you might have seen before. So you're really unlikely to see girls' Morris dancing at a folk event. And until very recently, in fact, there was quite a lack of awareness between the two communities. I remember, I always say the same anecdote, but I remember a group of secondary school aged carnival Morris dancers dissolving into hysterical laughter at my suggestion that men did Morris dancing at all. They'd never heard of it, and they were kind of, what do they wear dresses? Do they have pom-poms like we do? And I was like, no, it's just slightly different. But that kind of lack of familiarity really runs in both directions. And in the past, quite a few folk revivalists were a little bit dismissive of girls' Morris dancing. And really, the reason for that was that its participants are working class girls and women. Importantly as well, instead of identifying as folk dancers, girls' Morris dancers are more likely to describe themselves as belonging to something that they would term the carnival world. Carnival in this, and I know that this is a carnival organisation I'm speaking to, so this is really interesting. Carnival in this context is understood quite differently than the sort of popular West Indian carnivals that I know have taken place across the UK since about the 60s. And it's also almost the exact opposite of the well-known understanding of the term as theorised by Bakhtin and Kristeva in their depictions of the carnivalesque. Instead, I tend to kind of fudge it by saying it's a Northern British carnival performance whose roots lie in the popular town carnival movement, which is usually understood to have begun in the 1860s with the Knutsford Royal May Day. I know I'm probably sort of teaching to the choir here, but as many people know, the town carnivals emerged as a popular form of community self-entertainment in the mid-1800s, and it was in response to changing ideas about leisure time for working class people. And it was also aided by the spread of the railway network around the same period. Carnivals were felt to kind of embody a range of ideological and physical benefits for the working class poor. And at that time, there was a real kind of growth of community performances. Lots of kind of specialist troupes were developed at that time to entertain each other at these kinds of events. And often they would travel to different carnivals around the region to take part in carnival events. And one of the things that was very popular at that time was Morris dancing. And at that time, the term, it embraced a whole range of different kinds of performances that were performed by men, women, and children, and mixed groups of all of the above. Before I continue with a bit more of the history, perhaps, I wanted to show you a video of what girls' carnival Morris dancing looks like today. No, we've seen it. Okay. So yeah, it's quite different. Kind of, immediately, I think you can see that it's probably quite different from other forms of Morris dancing. And we'll talk a little bit about those differences and kind of what we can learn from them. So, in contrast to the sort of Morris dancing that perhaps you were talking about last week, there are a number of differences. And maybe one of the first ones that you might have noticed is that the performance is taking place indoors, and it's actually at a Pontins holiday park in Southport. This photograph that you can see on screen now is the same venue, just from the opposite end of the hall. And girls' Morris dances were once a really common sight in public street parades and carnival processions. But beginning in about the 1990s, the whole community moved almost exclusively indoors, and they transferred their competitions to private sports halls and community centres. Not private in the sense that they were, they don't belong to the groups, but they're closed events now. They're not open to the public. Reasons for this are kind of widespread. There isn't a single reason, but one of them is just that these kind of indoor venues were better climate controlled. I think there were a few too many summer carnival parades that were absolutely rained off and people got really tired of being drenched. So one of the reasons was, was to have more control. But also I think because of the role of competition in this community, they wanted to be able to be sure that when they were going to do their performance, they'd have the best kind of chance of doing a good job of it. There's too much at risk if you're doing it on grass and it may be a bit bumpy, it is a super competitive performance. So yeah, because of its movement indoors, in spite of its kind of roots in a very public kind of performance context, it is now something which you're pretty unlikely to see in public anymore. Just before COVID, in sort of last year, the last couple of years maybe, it did seem to be changing a little bit, but for a long time now, it's just been very much an indoor sort of private performance. Another thing that you might have noticed is the really highly precise footwork and synchronous choreographies. Those, I don't know whether anyone is familiar with, or I know maybe there are a few people that are familiar with clog Morris dancing, but you might have spotted that the driving triple step that they're doing kind of throughout the performance is a stylized variation of the rant step that's performed by Northwest clog Morris dancers. So the step is called the pas de bas or the pardi, and yeah, it goes throughout. They don't do any other stepping during the performance. It goes throughout. They do the kind of the variation is in the arm work and the pom-pom work and the formations that they create, but that the stepping is the same all the way through. And when the dancers all move sort of seamlessly together, the effect is really, really striking. It's almost like the kind of movement of machine parts, this kind of well-oiled machine all moving together. And this is something that the dance scholar Teresa Buckland has linked the performance's historical ties to the factories and the cotton trade, because quite a lot of the early Girls Morris troupes were formed from groups of factory workers. Not just factory workers, they're often associated with other places of work, with schools, with churches. It seemed to be something that was very popular, and lots of different kind of community groups would have their own carnival Morris dancing team. And another thing that's probably interesting, that doesn't come through in the video, is that while most other forms of Morris dancing tend to showcase a whole range of dances, so if you see a display of clog Morris dancing, they're probably going to do 3, 4, 5, 10 different dances, all based on different local traditions. Girls Morris troupes choreograph and aim to perfect a single routine every season. And they perform that routine weekly at their competitions, and that's the competition season runs from April to September, so they perform the same dance a huge number of times. And when that season is over, they stop performing that dance and they start to develop a new one. They don't tend to create any record of the dances, so once it's kind of served its purpose within that year's competition, they kind of forget about it and move on to the next one, which is quite interesting, in terms of as a contrast to revival Morris dancing, which is so very much based on this idea of documenting and and performing these old dances over and again. It's a totally different approach. And I think that sort of leads to one of the other big differences between folk revival Morris and carnival Morris dancing, which is the role of competition. So folk revival Morris dancing isn't really, as a rule, a competitive practice. But competitions are absolutely central to the Girls Morris dancing calendar. The photograph that you can see on screen is just part of the display of trophies that were on offer at the 2016 Etico end of season championships. There are awards for a whole array of different aspects of performance, and I think it's really one of those, there's an aim to celebrate everybody's contribution in one way or another. That kind of aspect is really important. Competitions in the Girls Morris dancing community are overseen by one of the many dedicated carnival performance organisations which are found across the Northwest and Wales. I don't know whether you've come across any of them, but a few that come to mind. So you've got Etico. They all have these kind of acronyms. So there's Etico, there's Maneco, which is the Manchester and North East Cheshire Carnival Organisation. There's a whole array. The most recent one I heard of is called TRU, which I think stands for Teamwork, Respect and Unity. So that they all have these acronyms anyway. And each organisation has its own distinct set of rules and regulations that governs the performance. And routines are judged on an array of factors by accredited Morris dancing adjudicators. This would be anathema to almost any folk revival Morris dancing side, I have to say. I don't think you could see in that particular video, but there's often up to 9 judges that will be surveying the performance on the arena. They have clipboards and they're very carefully watching every different aspect of the dance and you know, giving grades. I think I'm trying to think things that they're awarded for might be stuff like deportment, costume, choreography, rhythm. And there are penalties that are given for errors in timing. If costumes get damaged or they're scuffed, the shoes, which are very white, if they get, you know, dirty, they might lose marks for that. If they drop a pom-pom, which they call shakers, that's another mark gone. So yeah, it's very very competitive. Troupes can decide which organisation they want to compete under. And some troupes compete at lots of different organisations' events throughout the year, just for the kind of variation of different approaches. But on the whole, they do tend to be loyal to a single organisation. And that's because they need to accumulate a certain number of attendances throughout the year in order to qualify for the end of season championships, which takes place across a whole weekend in October. It's a really big event. You know, there's lots of different activities that take place in addition to the dancing, and it's a real kind of community celebration really of the year. Obviously this year, all of this has been completely cancelled, which is really, really sad and really concerning. We'll talk about that a little bit more maybe later, but that's generally, it is like a residential thing. You stay overnight, there's parties, there's fancy dress, all kinds of stuff, big thing. Also worth noting that the troupes are divided into different lines of dancers, and that's dependent on age and ability. So there are separate competitions for the very young dancers, who would be called the babies, and then it goes dinkies, tinies, juniors and seniors. The ones in the video are the seniors, but each troupe will have a whole range of different age groups that will be competing at a single competition. So as you can imagine, the competitions go on for a really long time. There are lots and lots of troupes and lots of lines within each troupe, so lots of competitions every day. There are separate prizes given to a leader, so that would be the one who kind of orchestrates the dances and ensures mostly that the lines are straight. And there's also a mascot in some of the troupes, and that's usually a younger dancer who kind of mimics the movements of the leader. And there's also a solo marching competition that takes place at the same kind of events, and that's where because the performances always begin and end with a march on and a march off, or they used to anyway, that sort of excellent technique in marching is rewarded with medals and stuff like that. And at the end of the year, there's this huge ceremony to celebrate those who've got the highest points total. And finally, sort of returning to the video, which now feels like a long time ago, you'll almost certainly have noticed that the performance is danced to recorded pop music. And that's one of probably the most obvious big differences between carnival Morris dancing and folk revival Morris, which is almost always performed to a live band. I know we've got a Morris musician in the room right now. So yeah, anecdotal evidence suggests that until about the 1950s, girls Morris dancing was also performed to live music. It was sometimes accompanied by an accordion or sometimes even a brass band. And they played popular carnival tunes like On the Quarterdeck and Scotland the Brave. But in the 1960s, vinyl records and then later cassette tapes, CDs, MP3s became the more popular choice. A bunch of reasons again for that. Troupes select and arrange their own Morris dancing compilations, their soundtracks, and it can be a mix of sort of pop music, party songs like I'll Tell Me Ma, or like Cotton Eye Joe, something, Puff the Magic Dragon, all those kind of, old-fashioned hits. Sometimes it's television themes, movie themes, basically anything that's kind of popular or whatever the troupe decide really. So it can be different depending on the troupe. And it's probably important to note that the performances the choreographies don't particularly relate to the music that's been selected. It's more like, it's just really to guide that foot placement to ensure that they're kind of stepping in the right time. So it's a little bit, I always think it's a little bit like the music in the gym. It's kind of, it's got a heavy beat, it keeps you wanting to dance. And the dances go on for about 7 or 8 minutes, and they don't stop at any point. So as I said before, they are exhaustingly difficult. People, have to be super fit. And often at the end of a really kind of important competition, people will faint. As soon as the performance is over, they kind of take their applause, and then people are unzipping their dresses and they're throwing water over themselves. It's like a massively competitive sporting event. People really give it their all. And the music is sometimes speeded up, sometimes it's slowed down, sometimes it can be switched off altogether in relation to the kind of requirements of the routine. Another thing that, I'm sure you can tell, that the costumes are quite different in appearance to those that you'll see worn by folk revival Morris dancing groups. And appearance is really paramount in the girls' Morris dancing community. And like their dance routines, they change their costumes annually if possible, if not as often as they can afford, and often there's kind of fundraising conducted to ensure that they can get new dresses, because it's one of the most popular aspects of the performance with the participants themselves. Girls' Morris dancing costumes are often likened to Irish dancing dresses or cheerleaders' uniforms. And recent years have seen a real marked preference for these very highly sequined costumes, very embellished fabrics. There's a move towards kind of performance lycra, kind of stretch lycra, often kind of holographic, metallic, very bling, very sparkly, very nice. And I think this is because it's all to do with kind of creating that spectacle when they're on the performance arena, when they're competing against their team, the other teams. They want to really, stand out. So these are the kind of fabrics that they go for. And in contrast, as perhaps you already know, folk revival Morris dancing sides, they tend to wear the same costume for a long time. They often base their designs on historical models, so archival photographs. There's a tendency to want to kind of reproduce an appearance of Morris dancing from the past, whereas girls' Morris dancing, it's very much about changing up to stay relevant to the present day and what the girls want to wear now. As an artist, I've been really, really interested in the Morris dancing costumes and the material practices around them. It was one of the things that I focused on quite a bit when I was doing my PhD. And one of the things I did was to apprentice myself to a carnival Morris dancing dressmaker. This is Samantha Heymer. She's the one of the trainers and the dressmaker for Orcadia Morris dancers. And yeah, I think for me, the costumes are part of this inaccurate perception that girls' Morris dancing is a modern invention. I think because the dresses change, they've changed with the times. If you look at the archival images of carnival Morris troupes from the past, you can really see this parallel with changes in fashionable dress, and the kinds of fabric selected. And this is kind of this contradicts some of the things that we sometimes think about tradition as something that's unchanging, that's of the past, that that isn't supposed to change too much or look too modern, because then it couldn't be authentic. There is quite a lot of sort of snobbery about working class culture, I think, and these dresses, people have said to me that they look cheap, but I think that they're absolutely sort of central to how girls' Morris dancing has retained its appeal amongst successive generations of young people, and that's without the need for any kind of artificial revival or preservation that you could argue is a really central feature of folk revival performances. I'm just going to throw in a picture here of a project that I did around the same time with garment makers in South Manchester, where we worked together to reinterpret the girls' Morris dancing costume using the fabrics and materials most routinely used in these designers' work. The folk arts, the English folk arts, are really marked by their whiteness, and these collaborations with an Asian outfitter and a West Indian fashion designer aim to envisage how the English folk arts might look with proper acknowledgement of the contributions of non-white people in the UK. And I held my final PhD show at the People's History Museum, and we had this newly choreographed performance wearing these sort of very different costumes. I think this is a really nice thing. So here's a photograph of a troupe from the 1920s, Greenfield Morris dancers. So you can see that the costume has changed quite a bit, and sadly these little hats have not survived it. I do quite like these little beanie hats. So in terms of the shared history, I'd like to be able to tell you a little bit more about that, and I have to say that this is still a work in progress. Understanding the history has been much harder to piece together than I had expected, I think. When I first started researching girls' Morris dancing, I couldn't really find anything else that had been written about it. There were a handful of references in other articles, maybe one piece of writing in full, but very, very little of detail. And actually quite a lot that there was quite dismissive, it was quite disrespectful about the performance. And so I found that the overwhelming majority of knowledge about girls' Morris dancing is held within community memory. Particularly, you know, amongst the older women in the community who can remember, you know, a lot of the kind of the major shifts, you know, from dancing in the parades to moving inside, the shifts in the music, all these kind of things. There's such a kind of wealth of knowledge out there, and no one really yet has taken a great deal of interest in that. So it feels like quite an important job to gather as much of that as possible while I can. So I can't necessarily give you a kind of you know, a full history of this performance, but what I can do is hopefully dispel a couple of the main myths about the performance and its history, because these are things that I sort of, whenever I give these talks, people will say these things, so I thought it's worth see if I can kind of dispel them here. So, as I think I've already said, you know, girls' Morris dancing is old. There's evidence to suggest that troupes of women and girls danced in the Northwest in the early part of the 19th century. So there are references from the kind of 1800s onwards, and by the 1890s, it was really, really common. I don't know if this is exactly the same in the south of England. So I know there are you know, men's Morris sides, you know, I'm thinking like Bampton in Oxfordshire, who will claim that they've had a tradition that's unbroken since, you know, 1423 or something. You know, I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, but I wouldn't want to take them on it because you know, they're quite fierce. But yeah, there definitely are references to women dancing Morris before the 1800s. I mean, even in there's a very famous document of Morris dancing, Will Kemp's 9 Days Wonder, where in the kind of, I don't know, 1500s, I think it was, you know, this Shakespearean actor danced from London to Norwich in 9 days. And in that, he dances with at least 2 women, and there's no suggestion in those documents that that was an unusual thing. So I think we can probably assume that there was Morris dancing, women did Morris dancing long before the 1800s. But the Northwest in particular, you know, it was very much a popular thing, and there were, you know, many troupes of girls in the 1800s. I think, in fact, some of the earliest references to Morris dancing in the Northwest are of women. So it's, you know, whatever anyone tells you to the contrary, it has been done for a long time. And this, you know, so as I say, the fact of girls' Morris dancing's existence at this time really kind of contradicts a popular assumption about girls' Morris dancing, which is that it emerged as a borrowing from the men's dance during the war. So the idea, and this gets repeated in scholarly texts as well, the idea is that, you know, the men went off to war, so the women had to step in and take over the Morris dancing tradition, you know, and then when the men came back, obviously they took their role back. Not true. Women were dancing long before the war, as were men and boys. You know. And this is, you know, interesting because although women's participation in Morris dancing, you know, is really commonplace now, you see it, you know, frequently at folk events, until as late as the 1970s and 80s, it was a really contested issue in the Morris dancing community. My dad is a former Morris man, and when I was growing up, he always used to tell me that women's participation in Morris was an abomination. It was absolutely wrong. Morris is a man's dance. It's inherently masculine. It's potentially even a male priestly rite. Women should not be involved in it. And if they do, it can only ever be a pale imitation of what the men do. You know, he's changed his mind since, I have to say, but yeah, this, and if you read, you know, kind of the folk magazines of the 70s and 80s, there was a real kind of gender war going on when the women's teams were starting to come through in the folk revival. There's even kind of actual evidence of the men's teams suppressing information about Morris dancing so that women, you know, couldn't take part. It was a really big deal. And this is particularly curious, I always think, particularly in the Northwest, which in its revival had quite a macho image. That the Northwest teams in the 70s and 80s kind of prided themselves, I think, on being quite, you know, hard drinking, you know, hard playing guys. It was very much a macho thing. A lot of the dances they were performing were collected from teams of women and girls. So very strange, you know, what can we say? What can we say? So I just to kind of prove this point, I just thought I'd show you a couple more of the archive pictures. This is one from 1905, and this is Ormskirk, which is the closest I could find to Skelmersdale, where Orcadia are based. So this is an all-female troupe, and behind them you can see there is a brass band playing, and often the troupes didn't have their own musicians, they just danced to whatever was playing in the street parade. So that's that. At the same time, and I kind of referenced it a little bit earlier, people often assume that girls' Morris dancing has been imported from somewhere else. So, for example, people sometimes think that it's more associated with cheerleading or with Irish dancing than with an English traditional dance form. I've not been able to find any sort of real links to the Irish dancing community whatsoever, although I do admit that the costumes look pretty similar. I know sometimes Irish dancing dressmakers will make the costumes for the Girls Morris troupes, probably because they're pretty similar in style. I think the Girls Morris dresses are often a lot simpler. Irish dance dresses are super detailed and beautiful. The Girls Morris ones, it has to be done on pretty cheaply on the whole. But probably the more interesting part is that Girls Morris dancing is actually quite a lot older than cheerleading, which is the one that people mostly, because of the shakers and the pom-poms, people often think, oh, it's just, it's American import, it's cheerleading. Cheerleading with pom-poms emerged in the kind of late 1940s and 50s. Prior to that, it had been a men's only activity involving clapping and rhythmic chanting. And this photograph of mobbly Morris men, again, Cheshire area, from the 1930s shows that pom-poms or shakers were a feature of Northwest Morris dancing at least 10 years before they were used in the US. So my sort of pet theory that I can't prove at all is that Girls Morris dancing is the precursor to cheerleading and not the other way around. Maybe like Girls Morris is kind of proto-cheer. It would be great if that were true. Another interesting thing from this particular image is in relation to the footwear that they're wearing. So in contrast to a lot of contemporary Northwest Morris sides, Girls Morris dancers wear soft shoes. They wear white pumps, and you can see the dancers in this photograph are also wearing shoes. There was, again, in the 1960s, when the sort of Northwest Morris revival was taking place, I think there was this idea that clogs were more masculine than shoes. Soft shoe dancing was seen as very feminine, so, I guess ballet in some way, whereas clogs was, was a blokey thing. And so most of the Northwest Morris sides took to wearing clogs, but actually their precursors didn't always wear clogs. Soft shoes are equally historically accurate as clogs. So yeah, again, not necessarily how I would have thought of it before I did this research anyway. So during my PhD, one of the things I did was interview former members of another troupe who used pom-poms, and this is the Lower-Whittington Senior Morris Troupe, and they were amongst the last co-ed, so mixed gender, Morris dancing troupes to perform in carnivals alongside both men's teams, the men's Northwest teams, and all-female carnival troupes. They're kind of that transition period that I'm trying to understand a bit more about. And I think their experience at least it evidences that this big split that we now see between the girls carnival Morris dancing community and the folk revival Morris dancing community is a relatively modern thing. Up until a certain point, even as late as the 50s, they all danced together, they all competed together. Northwest Morris used to be competitive as well. It isn't now, but it did used to be, and you can tell that from names like there's the Horwich Prize Medal Morris men. It's based on the fact that they did used to win prize medals in competitions. So again, it's not quite so opposite as sometimes you might think. And one of the things that came out of this project, I brought two members of a Salford-based Girls Morris dancing troupe to the Lower-Whittington Rose Day. And this was the first time that Girls Morris had been at the carnival since the 1960s, when the old troupe had to disband. And it was just a lovely opportunity for the old and the newer dancers to sort of talk about the performance and their different experiences, how things had changed, how things had stayed the same. One of the things that I remember coming out of the project was the discovery that Girls Morris dancing had actually been banned from quite a few carnivals in the 2000s, particularly in the sort of Cheshire area. And the kind of explanation for this was that people objected to the short skirts that the dancers were wearing. It was seen to be this kind of rather kind of unseemly activity for, working class town girls, and it wasn't an appropriate thing for a Cheshire village anymore. And I think this is something that, it's not the only time you see this kind of thing happening in relation to this sort of performance. Because Girls Morris dancing is performed in post-industrial communities, very working class areas, which have historically received less attention than their more affluent and culturally connected counterparts. It's another reason for their marginality. Girls Morris troupes are, almost always or very often located in areas, that are considered to be of high economic deprivation, including several towns and areas identified by the Arts Council as, you know, low participation neighbourhoods. And I always find that a little bit insulting because, you know, at the very least, Girls Morris Dancing suggests that, you know, rather than being disengaged or non-participant, that, you know, they have their own really rich and vibrant cultural practices and traditions that are just really just passing below the radar. They just, you know, they're not known about, they're not seen, and they're not valued. I think it's really important to value them more. I'm aware that I'm probably getting a little bit short on time, so before I wrap up, I just wanted to point towards Girls Morris Dancing's nearest neighbours in the British carnival world, because, you know, as I say, they don't relate so closely to folk revival Morris dancing, but they do relate to this idea of the carnival world. And you know, there are 4 performances that are generally understood to belong to this carnival world. This would be entertainer dance troupes, majorette baton twirling, and jazz kazoo marching bands. Yes, you heard that right, kazoo marching bands. And if anything, these are lesser known than Carnival Morris dancing. So because of Carnival Morris dancing's links to folk revival Morris, you know, at least it's kind of a little bit known of. But these other performances, you know, incredibly marginal, really. So the one on the screen at the moment is entertaining. It's sometimes just known as troupe dancing. I think that's probably its more common name within the community. On the face of it, it looks rather similar to Girls Morris Dancing. The costumes are quite similar, but you'll see they don't have pom-poms. And instead, the performance is characterized by these high kicks, these kind of chorus line high kicks, and also the formation of pyramids. So again, a little bit like cheerleading, they sort of create these human pyramids, quite complex tableaus, and they're judged on that. Again, slightly different to Carnival Morris. I don't know whether it came over in the video, but with Carnival Morris, one of the criticisms that it gets is that it's not very entertaining. Like, you know, they kind of dance at each other. There's not a defined front of stage. And actually the performance makes more sense when you see it from above. So occasionally, maybe once every couple of years, they have a competition at the Blackpool Tower Ballroom. And when you can see it sort of from above, from the balcony, it's fantastic. You can see all the shapes and kind of how it works. But actually, you know, they don't, you know, the audience has to sit in the round to really get anything from Carnival Morris. Entertaining, by contrast, borrows a lot more from kind of cabaret, from musical theatre. You know, the aim is to be entertaining as possible, and it really is. They still have that very kind of great emphasis on synchronicity, on marching. It has a lot of similarities, but yeah, more of a sense of playing to the crowd than Carnival Morris Dancing has, I would say. Also, there's majorette baton twirling. This isn't the best photograph, but I took this at a competition in Leeds. I recently moved, or last year I moved to Leeds, so I'm trying to find out more about the performances, the carnival performances around here, and this is one of them. Obviously, baton twirling is really, really well known all over the country, and actually, you know, worldwide. It's by far the most widespread of these performances. But there's a particular style which is associated most strongly with the sort of British carnival performance, and that's what they tend to call military or militaresque. A lot of emphasis on marching, a lot of emphasis on, you know, this particular kind of regimented approach to movement, which, you know, I'm not one for glorifying the military, but it is an incredibly impressive thing to see. It really, yeah, there's a real kind of snap and tension to it that is so impressive to watch. That they all really, you know, work super hard to achieve those kind of levels of precision and synchronicity. And then finally, I think this has to be my favourite one. This is the jazz kazoo marching bands. These are found primarily in former pit towns of the North East, the Midlands and South Wales. In this photograph, you can see the kind of kazoo section. They have the kazoos built up into kind of trumpets. And so they make their own music, you know, mouth music. They make their own music using their kazoos. Yes, they do harmonize. Incredible. They also, behind them, will have like a drum section. There'll be xylophones. There'll be, you know, glockenspiels, bell lyres, all that kind of thing. And again, a great emphasis on marching, almost like toy soldiers. It's again, a slightly different kind of style, but one of the most surreal and beautiful things that I've ever seen. Every year they have a competition, a big kind of world championships event, and it's usually held in somewhere like, I don't know, Walsall or Swansea. Well worth looking up on YouTube at the very least. There's some absolutely fantastic videos of these performances. And yeah, I mean, yeah, just incredible levels of pride amongst the performers and the communities that they come from in these, you know, these performance traditions. Because I think that's probably the thing that these performances all really share, and that is this really strong sense of community, of independence and self-determination. And as such, they often refer to each other as a carnival family. There's a lot of use of kind of familial signifiers like mum or grandma or sisterhood. You know, it's really a space of you know, yeah, community cohesion and togetherness. You know, since it moved inside, it's become quite an insular society, but a really, really close-knit one. And in addition to roles as being a dancer, which is obviously something that not everybody can do, there are a lot of other roles within the community that people take on around, you know, dressmaking, you know, driving the bus, you know, various kinds of supportive roles that people take, and these are, you know, equally important. The photograph is actually of a little mini project that I did a couple of years ago, and this is with Mrs. Elsie Maddock of Goose Tree in Cheshire, and she passed away last year, aged 96, and she taught generations of girls to dance in the Cheshire area, and she was also an adjudicator for the Lancashire Carnival Association for more than 20 years. So in 2018, we awarded her with a commemorative pink shield to go on the side of her bungalow to celebrate her, you know, many contributions to the Girls Morris dancing community. So to sum up, because I could go on all afternoon, Girls Morris dancing is a really crucial piece in the puzzle in understanding both our UK carnival heritage and also the overlooked role of women and children as performers and tradition bearers in the Morris dancing and folk dance world. There's still a heck of a lot more to be done to learn more about its histories and to support the practitioners through these really uncertain COVID times, but it is really so worth it. Girls Morris dancing reminds us that traditions don't have to appear to be old. They don't have to be male identified. They don't have to take place in remote rural locations or represent some kind of, you know, idea of an unlettered peasant. You know, they're incredibly valuable in their own right. And the main thing is that they're able to adapt to each generation's needs, and they belong to the community who practice them. So that's all I have for now. If anyone has any questions, I'd love to talk a little bit more about it. That's my website if you want to find out more. I've got a few articles about this. If anyone's particularly keen to read more, drop me an email and I'm happy to share them. But yeah, I'll shut up now.
Wow, thank you very much, Lucy. That was brilliant. So I'm sure that a number of contributors want to ask questions or make comments. So if you'd like to just unmute yourselves and dive in.
I've got a few questions. That was brilliant, Lucy. I really, really enjoyed it. Firstly, the term Fluffy Morris, do the Carnival Morris troupes use that themselves, or is that something that the folk revivalists, because I've heard it used by folk revivalists to describe this, would they use it?
Really good question. Okay, so yes, some contemporary Girls Morris dancing troupes do use Fluffy Morris as a term. However, the term originated from the folk revival. So it began as a kind of slightly derogatory name, and it was the male Northwest sides who called the girls, oh, it's just Fluffy Morris, you know, it's because they wear frothy skirts, they have the pom-poms. It was meant to be a little bit insulting, but the troupes kind of reclaimed it and they've kind of taken it on as their own. I tend to avoid it just because of its kind of origin, but it is sometimes used. Not all do. A lot of them just call it Morris dancing. It's, you know, because that's the kind of Morris dancing that they know best. It's only when I'm kind of trying to give a talk where I'm having to differentiate between different kinds of Morris that I have to kind of go, oh, it's Girls Carnival Morris. No one in the community would call it that whatsoever. They'd just say Morris.
Yeah. And what was their reception to you as coming in and wanting to learn more and asking questions and speaking to them? Were they worried about that, or were they very keen to speak to you? Has there been any opportunity for them to try and document their own history as well, or any, I suppose, need for them to do that, or, you know, desire?
Again, really good question. It was extremely hard to make contact with anyone in the Girls Morris community for the longest time. It really, really was. Basically, I found photographs in the archives of troupes of girls and was kind of a bit blindsided by this because, as I say, I grew up not thinking women really did Morris, and if they did, it was only very recently, and these were photographs from 100 years ago, and I was kind of like, what is this thing? And, you know, set out to see if I could find any contemporary troupes still in existence. It turned out there were lots of them, but they all had these broken websites that hadn't been updated for, you know, 5 years. I would email people and I'd never get a response. It was kind of, I mean, I think they're on Facebook is essentially the thing. At the time I wasn't, so maybe if I'd searched on there straight away I would have found them. It's very easy to find them on Facebook now. But obviously, you know, it's a private community. Most groups are private. It's pretty hard to find out where or when their events are happening. So it's not like Folk Revival Morris where there'll be a sign up in the, you know, in the pub to say there's going to be some Morris dancing next week. It's all private. If you're not part of the community, there's no reason why you would know anything about what they're doing and when. So I was really lucky that eventually I managed to find a man actually who is documenting some aspects of the history, and he's a former adjudicator for Etico, and he put me in touch with some people from Orcadia, and that was kind of my in, and it was becoming a kind of dressmaker for them that kind of gave me my real you know, access, because before that I think people just thought there was something wrong with me, like, you know, why would anyone want to research this thing? You know, I wasn't from the area, I'm not, you know, I think there was a lot of, you know, suspicion about what I think people sometimes think that I come from like child protection services or something. You know, there's kind of this fear of, it is such a kind of tight-knit community. There's a real kind of concern about outsiders and what you want, you know, what your motives are for kind of getting involved. I think it's changing a little bit, and I think you know, since I've been involved in it, there has been a few more crossovers with the Folk Revival Morris community, and I think there's a little bit more of a sense, I don't know, I'd like to think I'm a tiny bit responsible for kind of, you know, for making the case that these are not totally different communities, but actually they have this really important shared history. So I think it is opening up a little bit more now, but yeah, it was really difficult initially. In terms of people documenting their own histories, it was not something that I found in a kind of straightforward way. So I would say that yes, people do document that history. You know, there are lots of people keep scrapbooks, photo albums, you know, that these physical documents. People have got wardrobes full of dresses that they've worn for, you know, for many years, and they can trace that back. And obviously I think, you know, Facebook pages are incredible kind of digital archives of community practices. There isn't at this moment a lot of what we would sort of term, I guess, conventional scholarship coming from the carnival community itself. As far as I know, I'm still pretty much the only person to have published about it. And that, as I won't witter on about it too much, but it's always felt like a really big responsibility and not one that I necessarily want to hold on to. Like I'm very keen that the work I do is as much of a kind of collaboration as it can be. So in addition to the kind of published stuff that I've done for academia, and I did that, you know, partly because I think it's just really important to have it out there, and I wanted to, you know, but also because it, you know, I wanted to try and get a job in academia. I've also done a bunch of projects that are more kind of social projects, community-based projects, you know, where we've sort of, you know, created an exhibition or an archive, or we've had these kind of, you know, I did a residency in 2015 in Stoke, where it was with the entertaining community at that time, but we kind of created a site-specific performance in an old factory to kind of, you know, recall that history of the factory workers doing this kind of dancing. It's not perfect by any means, that, and you know, yeah, there's still always lots more to be done to ensure that, you know, all voices are heard, and it's not just me becoming the kind of spokesperson of this community that I'm not actually part of in a direct way. But yeah.
Amazing, thank you.
Could I ask a question, please?
You can. I can't hear you very
Oh,
well.
right.
I can. I'll just listen hard.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Bill. Just speak up.
Okay. I'm sorry, I had a problem with my laptop about 1:45, and I'm not quite sure if it's still working properly or not. Anyway, I think that point's been proven. Can I just go back to the term Fluffy Morris?
Yeah.
I was the leader of Mosley Morris Men for a number of years. I haven't been dancing for about 15 years now. My knees retired my body, unfortunately. But I was the unofficial historian for Mosley Morris Men, and I spoke quite closely with the historian from Manchester Morris Men on one occasion when Manchester Morris Men came to Mosley to dance, and we went into Manchester to dance alongside them. And he handed to me, let me see, it's a history of the Mosley Morris dance as recorded by a Manchester, well, by the chap I was speaking to. And that was collected by, I'm not sure how to pronounce this lady's name, I think it's Carpels, but I'm sure you've heard of Maud.
Maud Carpelese, yeah, sure, yeah.
Right, okay, yeah, thank you. And she came to Mosley in 1938 and spoke to a chap called Fred Hanby, who was the leader of the then, well, the Mosley side had gone then, it'd been gone for years before this visit. And she came to Mosley to collect the music and the steps of the Mosley Morris dance. And the Manchester man got the information from Maud, what is it, Carpelese?
I think it's Carpelese, yeah.
Something like that, yeah. We'll call her Maud anyway.
Yeah.
And I got a translation of it. But to get to the point on the fluffy dancing, again, two Manchester Morris men met a chap in a pub in Blakely, which is a suburb of Manchester, a bit of a seedy place really, a number of years ago, and he claimed he once danced with the Mosley Morris men, and he referred to ladies' dancing sides and the Cotswold traditions as being Fluffy Morris. And there was another chap called John Morgan who danced with Mosley Morris men. His name was Gypsy John Morgan because he, apart from being John Morgan, he was of gypsy stock. So it kind of stacks up. But he too commented on ladies' dance teams or sides and Cotswold tradition, again, as being Fluffy Morris. And that was way back in the 30s. So it would appear it's a term, not a very nice term, that's been handed down for many years.
That's really interesting. I mean, I've never heard Fluffy in relation to Cotswold dancing at all. And women's Cotswold sides are pretty rare. Not to say that they didn't exist, they certainly did. I think Maud Carpelese was involved in, or yeah. Cecil Sharp and Violet Alford certainly were involved with women dancing Morris. I don't know, my history is not fantastic, I'm not a historian. But no, I didn't know that. That's really curious. I'd be really interested to see that if you're able to share it with me.
I was searching for it while you were speaking and answering the question to the last question.
I mean, Maud Carpelese, for the record, hated girls' Morris dancing. She did collect it. She saw it. She wrote about it. She thought it was terrible. I have got some really damning quotes from Maud Carpelese about how dreadful it was and how it had completely lost touch with any kind of tradition. It was a completely, bastardized version of Morris dancing. She was not a fan. So I'm not sure how much I trust her take on it, but no, I didn't know that use of Fluffy. I mean, the person who told me that it came from the men's Morris troupes was a man involved in the carnival Morris dancing community, and I think he was saying something from the sort of 60s or 70s, but it's possible that it existed before then and it just got kind of revived or attributed at that time. Yeah.
Well, I know amongst certainly the northwest sides, Morris sides, Maud is held in quite high regard, it seems, more so than Cecil Sharp, who Maud is, of course, termed as being his assistant, as she no doubt was. But she's held in quite regard by northwest Club Morris sides as having saved the tradition and recorded the steps and the tunes that go with each town or regional dance. So rather than Mr. Sharp, who did very little for, it seems,
I mean, yeah, he wasn't great with kind of the more kind of urban traditions generally. I think he preferred it to be rural, but yeah, I mean, I mean, when I sort of critique the old folk collectors, it's not to say that they didn't do something really valuable. I think it's quite popular in folk circles to kind of, you know, to be critical of those collectors and say what a terrible job they did. And obviously, you know, without much of the work they did, we wouldn't have anything, you know, to be working with today as a tradition. So it's not about, you know, about saying that they were terrible in any way, but just I think it is really noticeable when you look into it that there were, you know, that women's traditions, children's traditions just were not present. They weren't seen as valuable at the time, and so we just know very much less about them. And that seems really like an oversight, and something that, you know, now that we're aware of this, it's good to try to kind of, yeah,
yeah, good.
Sort that out a bit.
Oh, sorry.
More questions?
Yeah, go on, somebody else.
Oh, sorry, Bill. Yeah, if you don't mind. Yeah.
Take the place over. I'm sorry.
I was.
Sorry.
I was just going to ask Lucy whether, in your opinion, is participation kind of growing? Is it plateauing? Is it diminishing? And so I guess that's one kind of question. Then the other one I had was, what within the community do you think some of their aspirations are? What are they looking to do next, or is it kind of fine as it is? Or
really good question. So sorry, the first question was
like levels of participation.
Yeah, interesting. It's really hard to tell. So on the whole, I think it's pretty stable. I have contacts who will tell me quite frequently, you know, that it's a real struggle to keep dancers, that in the past, you know, many more girls were kind of into doing it. It's a huge commitment. Like, being part of a Morris dancing troupe is a bigger commitment than I would ever want to take on myself. You know, it's practicing at least once a week, sometimes twice, and a competition on a Sunday. The competitions start at sort of 8 in the morning and they might go on until 6 at night. So you're giving up a lot of your time if this is something that you do. I think in the past it was seen as something that, you know, it was a great opportunity to travel, especially when it was, you know, the carnivals. People used, you know, it was for working class girls, it was an opportunity to go places and see things. And, you know, I think to an extent participation has declined, but it's still really thriving, I think. And I think the people who do it are extremely committed to it. So I think they perhaps feel that they have, you know, maybe slightly fewer in number, but a really strongly committed group. And I think where dancers used to stop almost always at sort of once they left home, 16, 17, 18, they stopped. Now people definitely go on dancing into their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. I don't know anyone older than 50 yet, but that doesn't mean they're not going to happen later on. You know, it really is becoming something that people stay with for life. And so a lot of troupes now have, you know, so I know I said that they have babies, tinies, dinkies, juniors, seniors. Some of them have multiple groups within each category. So there might be the senior diamonds and the senior platinums, you know, because they have so many, they can't actually all be on stage at once. So I think it's doing okay. It's one of those things, the folk revival, I always think is kind of characterised by the idea that folk things are dying out. And to an extent, I wonder whether just the fact that Girls Morris dancers say, oh, it's struggling, it's just part of that kind of fear that, you know, they've woken up to this fear that maybe they are dying out. And actually, I think they're all right. It will change, but you know, I think it's still, it's pretty safe for now, at least. The other question was to do with kind of aspirations for the future, which is a really good point. Because it's an issue and it's one I think about quite a lot. So my understanding is that the Arts Council, you know, want to fund excellence, you know, and so Girls Morris, when they have applied for this kind of thing, they don't meet whatever criteria for kind of excellence, world-beating excellence that they need to in order to, you know, to be seen as, you know, worth funding. My understanding is that, you know, the community doesn't particularly want to do anything else than they do. You know, I think it will change as it does, but there's no kind of great wish to kind of professionalize it in any real way. I think, you know, in terms of, I mean, it's difficult even to persuade people to do a performance outside of the kind of competition stage because, you know, well, because it's such a big commitment. If, you know, if they have a competition every Sunday, to have a performance as well is always, well, how, you know, it's about getting 60 people together and how do you do it? And it yeah, really tricky. So there have been opportunities, you know, been occasions where I've really worked hard to bring a troupe to an event or do something. Sometimes festival organisers say, oh, can't you bring some Carnival Morris to our festival? I'm like, I mean, I do try, but it just isn't the kind of thing that they want to do. And it's really difficult to kind of fund it, you know, make it happen, getting the buses, you know, it's just a lot of logistical challenge. I mean, I don't know whether this is relevant or not, but it's one of those things where it would make a fantastic TV documentary. So Carnival Morris dancing as a community, really interesting, really kind of engaging. Every now and again, TV filmmakers come around the Carnival Morris dancing troupes and try and persuade them to have a documentary done. Every time they come, there's like a shutdown and everyone says no. They always resist and reject any invitations to take part. I'm not saying it'll be like that forever. I'm sure at some point one troupe will say, yeah, let's do it, and they'll do it. But my understanding is that they're not interested in that kind of visibility. They don't want publicity particularly. You know, I think they're happy with it being a closed community, a safe community and a closed community. You know, so there are individual instances where they will perform outside of competitions, but it's not very often. And I'm not sure they're looking to, you know, to take on the world anytime soon, but.
Mel, are you speaking?
Yeah, I just thought Tom was about to say something else. Yeah, I've got a few little things. Really enjoyed your talk. Fascinating. Some things that, just two things really. One about the music turning off at some point, and the soft shoe, whether there's any other kind of sound to do with movement that they do musically in it, apart from, you know, the feet and pom-pom work, you know, whether there's sound connected with it when it comes off. And also, you know, you've just been talking to Tom about the withdrawal of the community to these nice little enclosed spaces that, you know, snug and warm. So I just wondered if it was anything to do with being banned at carnivals all over the place and being, you know, told you're too fluffy for this stuff. But I just wondered if that was just a gradual retiring back into somewhere, a safe space for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems likely, doesn't it, that, you know, if they're struggling to kind of actually find acceptance on carnival programs anymore, that it would just become easier to kind of organize your I mean, it's interesting. I think so older people in the Carnival Morris dancing community tend to kind of lament the fact that it's become quite as competitive as it has been. It was always competitive, but I think the nature of that competition used to be somewhat more fluid. So I think it used to have, there was more emphasis in the past on putting on a good show on the carnival field, pleasing the audience, you know, getting a big cheer at the end. You know, I think there was more emphasis on that. Now, the kind of criticism is that it's more based on not getting anything wrong. So, you know, the routines have to be perfect, you know, and the judging is based on kind of, how perfectly you execute the moves. And it's less concerned, I guess, with how entertaining it is, you know, and actually the troupes who try to do too many innovations often find themselves disqualified or just losing a lot of marks. So yeah, there's a tendency that the performances have got, so for example, one thing is that the performances have got smaller, so that the formations used to be big, they used to fill the field, it used to be, you know, about, again, because I think that was how carnivals were judged. When they went inside, they all bunched much closer together. And I think the idea is that it's much easier to, you know, to kind of hide any mistakes if you're all very close to each other and everything is very, you know, so, and the same with the costumes, actually. You might have noticed the very big sleeves, the very wide bell sleeves. They developed exclusively, as far as I understand, to conceal arm movement. So if you're going to get it wrong, if you've got these huge sleeves, it's kind of hard to tell. So there was a time in the 90s, well, sort of early 2000s, when the sleeves were, you know, gargantuan in size, absolutely massive. They've slightly slimmed up again now. But yeah, so I think it was a big part of it was that competition, and that sort of how important that became and how important it was to be absolutely, you know, precise. But yeah, for sure. I think, I mean, people tell me about, because it was so popular, there would be these parades that went on for, you know, hours and hours and hours, because there were so many troupes to get through, and competitions on the field where they'd go on into the night and they'd have to get car headlights shining on the space so that you could actually still see what was going on. I think carnival organisers got a bit fed up of it, and I think, you know, they just kind of went, you're gonna have to, you know, sort it yourselves out, because we can't do this. And your first question was to do with sound. That's a really interesting question. So I realised, as I said it, I was slightly inaccurate, because the switching on and off of music is more something that's associated with the entertainers. They definitely do turn their music off when they do a tableau. So they'll have their, you know, their dance seems to be, it's sort of split into maybe four or five little excerpts of dancing. They're often themed. The music is you know, contained to that 2 or 3 minute performance, and it always ends in a tableau. So they kind of do their thing, they get into the tableau, the music stops, and they hold it for however long, and then the music starts again, and they carry on. In Girls Morris, the music doesn't tend to stop so much, but it always starts in a weird place. So I've always found it really comical that they don't like start at the beginning of the song and then do their performance. The music just comes on, they start dancing, and then all of a sudden they go zip, and the music is off, and the dance is finished. And it's so strange. And they don't really take applause, everyone goes, they just walk off. It's like the music stops and the whole thing is over, because the music stopping denotes that the competition is finished. So suddenly they can, you know, collapse in a heap, they can cry, they can do whatever it was they were holding in during this performance. In terms of the sound, I did once take some video of them warming up. And so they wear bells on their shoes. So you've got the kind of ching, ching, ching of the dancing, of the bells, and it's the triple steps, so ding, 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 ba-ding, ding, ding, ba-ding, ding, ding, all the way through. And there's the swish of the pom-poms, but it's very hard to really hear these things in competition, because the music is extremely loud. Yeah, really, really loud. But I think from an artistic point of view, I think there would be a lovely kind of bit of video art to kind of capture some of those ambient sounds of the dancing when you don't have that really loud music playing. I think it's quite mesmerizing in a way. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
Lucy. I mean, actually, you've answered some of my questions around. You seem to be suggesting, for instance, that the move into the interior, as it were, has kind of lent more focus on competition and accuracy, as opposed to that carnival vibe. And I'm hoping I can share with you in a moment a picture I did show you actually a few weeks ago. There's a picture of Mosley Carnival, Stamford Road, with a Morris Girls troupe, what I would have called before this talk a cheerleading group, coming down Stamford Road, and they've got their pom-poms. But my question is, you talk about this sort of value of working class culture, and it's one of its dynamic natures in terms of being remade so that tradition can be seen as dynamic and made relevant, therefore, to communities now. Is there a kind of tension there between what has been and what might be
within the community itself?
Yeah.
It's a really good question. I don't know. The tension, as far as I see it, and I mean, it would be something I would need to ask my contacts about more, but the tension that I see is between the older and younger members of the community. So, you know, obviously, on the whole, you know, the older trainers, you know, remember really fondly the days of the carnivals, and, you know, and think it's kind of a pity that today's youngsters don't get that experience. I think, and certainly not all the trainers like the music. There's quite a lot of sort of the principles of so teams tend to have a principal and a group of trainers, and often the principal is someone who's been in the community for, you know, a long time, and they often don't like the music. But I think they're very kind of, they genuinely are understanding of the idea that that is how you keep the girls, that the dancers, you know, when they get to pick the music, they feel a sense of ownership over that performance. And I think, again, in the way that, and I'm going to be wary of how I say it, because I don't, I'm not trying to disrespect at all the folk revival approach, and that is where I came from, the folk revival. But where that is about kind of recreating a dance of, you know, of the past, carnival Morris dancing is about creating it, so that, you know, the choreography is a collective task. You know, it's not something that's passed on, it's something that everyone in the team has their opportunity to kind of, you know, to build this thing. And the same with the music, the same with the costume designs, everything is kind of created by the team, by the community, and that means it really belongs to everybody. And I think people feel very proud of it, and very, you know, very yeah, just a great sense of pride over this thing that they've all created together. So yeah, so I think there are there's preferences, you know, amongst with some trainers prefer certain kinds of music than others, but I think on the whole, I think Carnival Morris dancing has never had that narrative of revival or looking back, preserving. They're just not interested. Once the season is over, it's gone.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, I've the little clip of video I showed you, very difficult to persuade Orcadia to let me take a video, because they actually don't want any videos of their performances, certainly not in their entirety. They're very, very clear about that, because their fear is that it gets out and other troupes learn it from them, and if it goes on YouTube or on social media, then they can be, you know, they can be copied. So I was only ever allowed to take short bursts of video, and I was only ever allowed to keep them for myself, and occasional little viewings like this one, but never the whole routine. But again, for me, as a kind of, you know, as a researcher, I'm like, oh, but what about keeping a record? What about knowing what you did 10 years ago and being able to go back? And, you know, different troupes have different ideas about that. So there are lots of videos of troupes dancing at different times, and you really can see how things have changed. But yeah, contemporary troupes can be quite precious about that kind of thing.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Can I?
You
go
go ahead.
Go on,
Okay.
I've had my 5 minutes.
But it was just on that. Just I find that fascinating, and what you mentioned in the formations themselves, that this phrase of dancing to ourselves or dancing for ourselves, that's just coming through so powerfully, and again that sense of, you know, and once it's done, it's done. You collapse on the floor, but that is because you've had that thing. That's it. It's a really interesting concept, isn't it? Of what dance and what art can be. It's really fascinating.
I mean, I find it really moving. I think the best example of it that I you know, the strongest example is the jazz kazoo marching bands, because, you know, they are big teams. They're bigger than the Carnival Morris teams. They often have, you know, 30, 40 members all playing this music. They train all through the year in very, you know, often they're associated with some of the poorest, you know, most deprived communities that you can imagine. You know, really small places, really challenging kind of conditions, and they practice all through the year, you know, and they go to this competition, and they do their lap of this of the venue, and the whole, you know, the crowd is roaring and cheering and waving flags, and it's so moving, because there is no other context for this performance. It has no purpose. You don't make money out of it. You don't really get any great kind of notoriety, except within that room of a few thousand people, maybe. I mean, a few thousand people is a lot of people, but, you know, it just doesn't have any kind of visibility outside of itself, and yet the amount of effort and energy that goes into it is immense, and I just think it's, you know, wonderful and beautiful that people spend that time on creating something, even, you know, out of very little, and when there's, you know, in really difficult conditions. So this year has been really kind of upsetting because of all these things being cancelled for all the communities, and there's been various ways that they've tried to adapt to that. There have been little, you know, like at-home competitions via video and things, but it's not quite the same, and I know that people are really, really missing, you know, missing being together, and, you know, as all performers, as everyone are, but it does feel, you know, concerning for some of these troupes about, you know, what the future is. But yeah, very, very different to almost any other form of dance that I'm aware of, you know, or you know. Oh, but I think what I was going to say was that they so when in competition, they wear the sparkly dresses or the sparkly uniforms. When they're not in, you know, when they're sitting on the sidelines waiting for their performance, they don't wear their costumes, because obviously they don't want to get them dirty and then lose crucial points in the adjudication. So they wear a lot of kind of team wear. So they have hoodies and tracksuits and t-shirts and stuff, and they always have slogans and little things on the back of them. And the one of the jazz bands has the slogan, "It's only a hobby." And it always seems so kind of apologetic, as if to sort of say that people have gone, "What are you doing this for?" And they go, "Hey, it's only a hobby, you know, I'm not hurting anyone." But I do think there is this kind of feeling that people don't understand this thing. You know, when they see it, it gets ridiculed. It's seen as a bit silly. You know, what is this thing? What are you doing it for? But it gives people a great deal of pleasure, and it's that kind of, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to do this, even though no one cares about it, even though we've got no funding. We're still going to do it, and it matters. It matters to keep this thing going. I think it's lovely. I think it's really lovely.
Bill, did you want to speak?
Oh, yeah, only very briefly. Lucy, I think you've opened the door to a secret garden with what you've said to us. I mean, I probably have a, 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 a greater awareness of ladies dancing, Morris dancing, than some of the other people who are present. I may be wrong, but that's what I suspect anyway. But during my own research, I did my BA on the rush bearings of the northwest of England, and of course, obviously the Morris team leading a rush cart played a great part of that. But to get to the point, while I was doing that research, it was quite apparent to me, and I have mentioned this previously, certainly to Jane, that the Morris dancers were their own worst enemies, really, as were the chaps who pulled the rush carts on some occasions, in as much as they were a rebellious and drunken rabble. It was one quote in a newspaper of the time, and they weren't far wrong, really. I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that you could liken them to the football hooligans of the 60s and early 70s, where the towns had their own colours and what have you. Each Morris had its own colours, and you could recognise them by the colours, as you can today, indeed. And they were at each other's throats in drink, and it was dreadful. They're their own worst enemies. And of course, the middle classes and the church, local councillors and what have you, went to great extremes to stop it all, and eventually they did it. They had to realise that they were their own worst enemies because of the behaviour in the public.
That's what, so I mean, because it's not generally like that now. I would say is what sort of time are we talking about?
I would say not in public anyway. But I'm not suggesting there's brawls and things. There's certainly exchanges of opinion in private places.
I just remember seeing some sort of maybe from the 1970s, a feature from ITV News or something about I think it was Saddleworth Morris men, and the way they were extremely misogynist. They were extremely kind of, I don't know, just very macho. There was a real sense of it being a real lads club. I don't think it's quite like that now, but
maybe not. But some sides are worse than others, shall we say, without naming names.
Okay.
There is historical records to show, and I've never had any reason to doubt this whatsoever, that where the male sides in Northwest Morris began to fade, or events were stopped, such as the rush bearing, the churches in particular welcomed and promoted ladies dancing, children's dancing of Morris events, because it was nice. You didn't have the drink, you didn't have the violence, and there is a broad band in my view running right the way through the tradition, throughout the country perhaps, that ladies and children have supported the sides and kept the tradition going in their own little towns and what have you. And I now know that I've seen ladies carnival Morris from what you've said and what you've shown today. I think it's absolutely fantastic, and I've always had strong views on ladies Northwest Clog Morris sides. Milltown Cloggies being one of the finest in the area, having known them, danced with them, and socialised with them. They brought some respectability to Mosley Morris men on occasion.
I'm sure that's quite a challenge as well.
I'll actually tell the ladies when we have a Zoom meeting every Monday, just to keep in touch as a group. So I'll actually tell them that you sent your regards. Just on that, going back to the Greenfield girls, Morris side, I know I could see that they were holding the cotton reels, as they not twizzers, but they had cotton reels with flowers on, I think. Well, the Milton Cloggies, they still use these cotton reels, but they have bells on rather than flowers now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it would be an interesting project to try to kind of trace or to look at the kind of different variations from the pom-poms to the, you know, the shillelaghs, do they call them sometimes? And
not sure about the shillelagh. I thought that was something else, but
they are called it too, but yeah.
But I mean, our girls dance with the cotton reel, you know, the old Lancashire cotton reel.
Yeah.
And they also have like another, well, they have a stick, what we call sticks, which again come with a bobbin on the top, which comes from the Lancashire mills.
Yeah. Very nice.
So.
Thank you for that, Norman. Lucy, it's almost 3:30.
Thank you.
So we've taken quite a lot of your time.
It's been great.
But thank you so much. I think if there are further questions, then that we can direct to you, you'd be okay about that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah?
I mean, you've got my email address, so feel free to share it, and obviously my website. But yeah, do get in touch if you want to look at I've got articles and photographs and stuff. So yeah, do get in touch. I'd love to carry on the conversation. But really nice to get to chat to you today.
Thank you. I think that some of our artists may have specific questions around some elements of the tradition, but certainly you've opened up a world, a carnival world that I didn't know anything about. So thank you very much.
No worries.
Yes, thank you. Zoom applause. Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you very much to everyone again for attending, and there is a session scheduled for the 1st of December, and I will send you Zoom details once again. Thank you very much to Lucy. Thanks to all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy.